So now we'll start the roundtable on securing the supply chain to protect your suppliers and reinforce your industry. Please let me welcome on stage the 5 participants to this roundtable to join me. Welcome Elise Bablar, Coordinator for Safety for Supply Chain at Airbus, Samuel Bro, Regional Security Manager at Schneider Electric, Lucille Coupé, Governance Security Group and Risk Management at Luxo, Raymond Birens, Chairman of the Board at Connect to Trust Foundation, and Catherine Rand, Principal at Sandberg Tax. So I presented briefly.
D'entre vous peut prendre 1 ou 2 minutes pour se présenter et présenter son entreprise. Commence avec vous.
So if you could maybe introduce your company. First of all, thank you very much. Good morning. I'm Elise Bablar-Roland, so I'm in charge of defining and coordinating the program related to securing the supply chain within the corporate security department at Airbus. I'm also in parallel a cyber trainer in the National Navy. So Airbus, I think you all know them. You know who they are. Airbus is one of the world leaders as a builder, and also they work on defense and space activities via their division, and also with helicopters. Lucille, good morning everyone. It's much easier. So we make glasses and equipment to manufacture glasses, and also for the diagnosis of the whole chain for opticians. So I've been in cyber for about 15 years with several roles and in charge of managing risks today within the corporate department in governance at Luxottica. Samuel? Yeah, as was said before, I work in the ISO teams at Schneider Electric. So Schneider Electric, I will not introduce the company. I think you all know us. I'm also an administrator, and at Schneider, there's a bit more than 50,000 stakeholders in the ecosystem of the company. So, which is why we wanted to talk about supply chain. We'll come back to that just after. Catherine?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Wang. I'm very honored to be here today. So I here representing a company called Sandbox AQ. We sit in the strategic intersection between quantum technology, not quantum computing, but quantum technology and artificial intelligence. So some of the things that we do include quantum sensing, quantum navigation, quantum simulation, and then for the purposes of our conversation today, quantum cybersecurity through post-quantum encryption. Prior to this, I was at Google for about 16 years, and I've been in cybersecurity for about 7.
So Raymond Birens, Chairman of the
Birens.
Foundation. We're an NGO that is sharing threat intelligence, which we receive from various governments, but also from the private sector, and we mainly focus on companies who are multinational, so usually in multiple countries, and also are usually quite large and therefore complex, having a lot of IT, OT, and IT in them.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation.
Thank you very much for this quick presentation. So when we start the roundtable, sometimes it's useful to define the scope, and I would like you to do it. So I will start with you, Elise, maybe defining what is the supply chain from your point of view. Well, supply chain is a vast topic, because in fact it's a whole ecosystem that we have to take into account. It starts with designing the product up to the final delivery and the customers. So if we look at, for example, the example of Airbus, Airbus is more than 18,000 suppliers in the field, so which are divided into 3 categories. The first one is defined through suppliers very much focused on aeronautics, and they have to apply specific regulations. We have a second category that is defined as well with suppliers focused on not the same regulations, basically, and the third category as well which is suppliers that are outside of the aeronautics, but they take part in the whole of the ecosystem with these products and services that they deliver. I will carry on with you. Yes, supply chain, initially the word was very much related to the industry, so supply, provide, so supplying something for an end customer. Today we realize that it's to do with company governance. We have less and less scope. I have none, in fact. So as soon as it's a product or something that can be sold to our group from an entity that does not belong to the group, basically it becomes what we call a seller now. We call that seller. So in fact, a supplier or provider or whatever, it doesn't really reflect anymore the stakes for today. So the more scope, an ecosystem that is very volatile, because in fact, so whether consultants, consulting companies or service providers or new technology, disruptive technologies, these are ecosystems that are very, very fragile, that can be bought, transformed. Sometimes we have contracts for 3 years, and in 3 years, I mean, it's huge, you know. The services or products in themselves will evolve so many times. So for risk, in terms of risk analysis, it's endless, in fact. So the scope is never carved in stone. Samuel? Well, just to complete what we said before, we do a lot of things at Schneider. So we could be developing a robotic solution for an individual customer and then support a player to develop wind farms. And in this case, we have a whole ecosystem of providers, vendors, etc., as we said just before. So this takes us in our organization to, well, we give a lot of importance to the value chain, which is why today we have a specific organization in the cyber team that manages this risk in terms of supply chain at all stages of the life cycle of a product that can be hardware or software. You will see that around hard and soft we can have a whole ecosystem that is rather wide, and so the strategy is that we have to look at the risks related to the ecosystem in terms of all the subsidiaries that are depend on the group, but also our partners that we work with, basically. So maybe to go back to what we were saying before, so indeed we'll have the design phases and manufacturing phases. There's more than 200 plants in the world, so we have some risks as well around those activities. But not only, because when we have to implement a system that will be on a wind farm, to go back to my previous example, we'll have several steps that will consist in operating tests in the plants before the solution can be implemented with our customer or at the plant. And so we have these staging and commissioning phases and operating phases. So in the run phase, there is a risk as well related to the ecosystem, to do maintenance or to operate the system. So I widen the scope, in fact, the supply chain, without even taking into account the decommissioning or fallback, shutting down when data is confidential that can be exfiltrated if we have an intrusion at that stage.
I will be brief. I think the other panelists already defined it pretty well. We all see very common understanding of supply chain. The one thing I would add to this is I see supply chain as being a very akin to the concept of a relay race, right? So you are handing over the baton to the next person, and through that chain, if anybody drops that baton, we have a cybersecurity problem. Now, this makes sense when your organization is small, you only have 5 people on your team, but when you get to the size of the folks on this, or even the organizations you all are part of, that is an enterprise level relay. So that's why we are all here so passionate about supply chain, because any weak link and all of a sudden we have a vulnerability that could compromise our mission.
So let me close this off by perhaps taking a different approach. 2 things which for us are definitely not supply chain. Supply chain is not a procurement problem, because it's way beyond procurement. It's the third party, the nth party. It's a much more complex ecosystem behind a single supplier. And the second is it's not an information security problem, it's a data security problem. So for us, information is just structured data. But if you just stay at the level of information security, you're getting stuck in the legal aspects of privacy and information security, which are relevant. But if you don't take a more architectural, data-driven approach on making sure your supply chain is also protecting your risk, you have the risk of having the wrong definition.
Merci beaucoup. Quels sont aujourd'hui
Thank you very much. So what are the main types of cyber attacks targeting the supply chain? Any answer with you, Elise, and maybe an example? Well, overall, regarding the cyber attack parts, we can mention several. I believe that you have to take into account the fact that if we summarize the data leaks today and why securing the supply chain has become a priority risk for us all, is because, well, for two reasons, in fact. Two main things. The first thing is a supplier that is hacked at home. Potentially, they have to stop their production and they cannot deliver us. And second of all, if a supplier is hacked potentially by the connections that they have with the end customers, the attack can go to the end customers as well, which is why today securing the supply chain is everybody's business, and we have to all together make progress in the same direction. So if we look at, I might not take an example, concrete example, but I mean, we can mention Satis. Satis was mentioned publicly, and they were really, this was an example, and thank you, Satis, as well, for making it public and sharing and explaining. So Satis is a company that takes part in our ecosystem, aeronautics, especially for paint and surfaces. So Satis was cyber attacked and hacked, I believe, in 22, and was stopped by a cyber attack for several months. So if we take another example, I won't mention the name of the company or the supplier, but we have other key examples showing how, in fact, a cyber attack can have a financial impact, a significant one for the supplier, but also for the end customers. Why? Because, as I said before, the supplier has to stop and so in their production, and they cannot deliver us. So we had cases before. We had planes grounded, and it's very costly when your plane is grounded, and it has a cost up to several thousands or millions of euros due to a cyber attack. So this is what I can say today in terms of examples. Lucille? Well, to illustrate as well and talk about this in another way, so it's great when you, well, no, not great. In the cyber world, we are happy when we see that there is an attack, because at least, you know, we see it. In terms of suppliers, it's more difficult because, in fact, the suppliers that are hacked, they don't always tell us. And sometimes it's business as usual, and we know nothing about it. So the monitoring part is very, very important today. And today, the participants in the previous events said it before. So this is a question of trust, and you really have to put the human being at the core of the process. So it's not just a contract between two companies, it's also human beings which make that, you know, this contract is operational and it exists. So it's even more important to monitor them, because sometimes, so 1 week ago, in fact, I called the supplier saying, hi, there is, you know, you are being hacked. And I saw it on LinkedIn. So it's not only tools that are very expensive. Sometimes you can also see some things, and on an ecosystem that I knew well, I investigated further, and we did what it took, and we were in crisis management, just like what we do with our subsidiaries. So it can go very far, and you know, we have to follow next week with the suppliers. Catherine, if you want to say something, Samuel?
Yeah, I'm going to paint a slightly different picture for you all. So I mentioned I was in cyber for quite a few years, just shy of a decade, and I spent much of that time working with the federal government in the United States. So we were doing a lot of threat intel, and I want to bring an angle from the supply chain that affects everybody in here who not only uses technology, but also creates technology through your businesses. We mentioned earlier about the problem of hardware. Right, so as we think about supply chain and making sure that what devices you are bringing into your offices and your companies, that they are not inherently Trojanized. That is a vector, that is a threat that we are seeing happening today. So while we're talking about the urgency of breaches, data exfiltration, and some of these other challenges, I want to paint a slightly different picture where the cyber adversary doesn't want you to know that they are there. It is in their best interest to continue seeing you operate efficiently, because the more you produce, the more that they can exfiltrate, the more they could potentially steal. We're talking about supply chain vulnerabilities compromising your intellectual property because you haven't taken the precautions to lock that down. Now, what we're seeing from a hardware manufacturing standpoint, a lot of this is happening overseas, in China in particular. So imagine if you are a powerhouse being able to produce cheaply a lot of this hardware devices, especially during COVID and whatnot, where a lot of these items were difficult to procure and bought somewhat in a commoditized way. Now we have cheap, overseas made, insecure, pre-Trojanized hardware sitting within our homes, within our connected devices, within our companies. So that, to answer your question, Fabrice, is one of the areas where I'm seeing a lot of potential vulnerabilities.
Samuel, vous vouliez réagir? On va donner la parole aussi après à Raymond.
Peut-être partager quelques chiffres pour.
Maybe share a few figures for. So for France, it's almost an incident for a supplier working with us per week since 4 or 5 months. So just to say that this risk is major, significant, and you have to address it, you have to tackle it, and we'll discuss later the challenges of visibility and monitoring.
Voilà ce que je peux dire.
That's what I can say in terms of figures. I have no other elements on this topic. But visibility, yes, is really important, with an impact on an incident that we could have with a supplier that can affect business, but also the company's image via an entity that you work with on HR topics or finance that does not have a direct link with business for an end user. But in fact, it's part of the landscape that you have to tackle when you talk about supply chain.
Yeah, so we supply information to around 2,000 multinational organizations in Europe mainly. One of our biggest challenges is that the official channels that are distributing information on Trojanized devices are usually driven by legislations like the NIS2. One of our concerns with regards to the supply chain comes back to the earlier point of trust. Because what we've seen for the past year is that we had many incidents where the early warning, so when a supplier actually provides you a heads up on something which is patchable, so a vulnerability that can be resolved, is only then just in time to mitigate the risk which is taking place at that time. So that means if you follow the official channels by getting a government notification or a shadow server notification, then you are basically getting the notification you're too late. It has already taken place. So beyond legally requiring companies to provide a notification, it is the trust element where a supplier should know its customer and the customer can rely on the supplier, whether it's being Google or Schneider or any company, getting notified as soon as possible, or perhaps even before it's patched, but just in the status where we're researching if something is taking place. And for those of you who are in the technology, the current debate on Oracle is, for example, a very interesting example where trust supersedes just the formal fact that it may or may not take place. You rely on the trust to make sure it can be mitigated.
Catherine?
Yeah, I actually think that ransomware, data exfiltration, Trojanized hardware, all of this they're just all key components within maintaining a very strong zero trust architecture or principle. And I'm learning as I'm here on this panel, it seems like this audience and Europe in general has a very different approach to trust, whereas in America, it's very, we are all fallible. And as a result, it's not necessarily that we don't trust each other, it's this we don't trust adversaries, creativity in trying to exploit our own psychological shortcomings. So I would completely agree. While supply chain is a symptom, zero trust is the source.
Merci beaucoup. Si on essaye de résumer les...
Thank you very much. If we try and summarize the arguments, why is supply chain become such a preferred target for cyber criminals? Well, it's actually easier because the life cycle, as it is connected to industry, we fall back into the OT, IoT, IT, the basic issues, which are sometimes preferred. Well, the teams prefer going for POCs rather than checking that the backups are actually reliable. So back to basics. So these are, at the end of the day, the ecosystems that actually are the same life cycle of the robots, and those robots are there 50 years later, 50 years on. There are some technology advances, even putting AI on it. It's the same foundation. So some things are very slow to evolve. So it's very easy than on ecosystems that only have a 2-year life cycle. It's easier to get in and stay there and listen to what's happening. So there is a major gap between this situation and the new technology advances, including AI and quantum and so on. Quantum plus AI, honestly, I don't know. The two combined, is it going to be complicated? Well, this gap is a really wide gap, and we should really ask the question every day, are the basics observed? As we said, today it is a governance issue, but if we don't go down to the factories to see what's happening, how the processes are adapted, and the process is nothing when you think about it compared to a process, methodology process on a production line with monitoring that is just a tool somewhere that's going to monitor about 100 vendors. So it's a multi-layer thing. Elise, Samuel, what do you think? Well, if I take the example of Airbus, as I said before, it's 18,000 suppliers, so you can imagine the surface. And in these 18,000 suppliers, just tier 1, okay? Then you have all the challenge of tier N associated. 18,000 suppliers means profiles that are very different from one from another. We're going from the major company to the very small family business. You have to take into account these profiles that are very different and diverse, and raising questions about the priorities of these companies. So when we talk about the security of the supply chain, we should position ourselves on the supply side and try and understand their own issues. So the typically family business is with like 3 people at the bottom neck of the wood in France. I mean, cybersecurity means nothing to them, and it's not a priority. So maybe it's potentially a supplier that is dependent on one. I think in this Supplies Act, we'll have a real issue in terms of delivery. So the question is, what can we actually obtain from this type profile in terms of security? How can we best support them? What would be the priorities in terms of products and services delivered? And this is really, we're talking about raising awareness and trust. This is a true support that we as larger groups should do to better secure the whole ecosystem while taking into account the various profiles. We'll come back to this. Samuel. Well, I totally agree what has just been said and what's been felt by Airbus. We have the same profiles of suppliers. We can have very small entities with 2 to 3 people in mechanics. Said like this, they are not at digital risks because they don't supply any connected products. But if they are concerned, and I have a couple of examples in mind, if they are concerned by a cyber incident, we could assess it as being low risk because they are not connected to us, no direct risk on our products, but simply if they are not available in the production of the envelopes in which we can put some of our products, mechanical envelopes, we have an impact, a direct business impact. And in this precise case, the people who are into mechanics are, of course, less mature than others who are supposed to help us develop some software. So there is a very diverse population in terms of maturity, so it generates a lot of noise or a lot of time spent to onboard them and to better integrate cyber, even if we are not at the core of a business.
I actually really appreciate those two comments in particular, especially when it comes to small businesses, and then also, how do you balance security in the stream of other priorities that you have in industry, right? We're here talking about industry. We reward speed over security. That's a big problem. We need to find a better balance between the two. And for anybody in the audience who is not, a large enterprise like Boeing and Schneider Electric, I would say if you're worried or you're thinking my data is not that important and it's not worth stealing, I've seen supply chain vulnerabilities allow lateral movement for cyber adversaries to hack dating apps. The dating apps are then used to do love scams. I've seen supply chain vulnerabilities hack into medical hardware devices, allowing hackers to potentially hold people for ransom without ever having to kidnap a single human being. So when you think about the speed versus security, when you think about your size or even the data that you have, don't underestimate the value of that data to a cyber adversary, and don't underestimate the need to harden your supply chain.
Je voudrais ajouter finalement
I wanted to ask us what we are saying.
La pierre angulaire, c'est
The cornerstone is to stop thinking that a supplier, vendor, whatever you call it, is critical because of the economic volume in the company, because they deliver or are in business one of the critical departments of the company. That's very complicated because there is no geographical limit, there is no business limit. It's like a fingerprint. When you meet someone for the first time, you want to know who you're talking to. Well, it's exactly the same thing here. So, of course, if it's a table vendor, well, it's not really, what's going to be on the table is going to fall with the table, it doesn't matter. But maybe in 6 months, this table will be connected, and you don't know about it. So knowing the business, knowing the vendors in what they can do in their profiles, whether small or big, I am addressing a startup or a larger group the same way. There are 250,000 in the world, 240,000 in the world, and so much successful business. We are in 150 countries. We cannot know everyone. So it's the same assessment, the same classification each time. Same process, whether it's the Gartner #1 or someone is going to do a POC with 3 people in the neck of the wood. It could extend. If tomorrow, if the business doesn't go and see the purchases, it could invade part of the business at different places. So the risk is really present everywhere.
I think one of the challenges in managing the supply chain is, for many, especially the larger organizations, is twofold. One is that managing a supply chain doesn't mean just imposing more rules and frameworks upon an organization, because especially a smaller organization simply cannot handle a threat profile similar to a large organization, especially when they're in the nation-state threat level. So that's something you need to take into account. The second one I find is that it's on the willingness to pay. Because if you want your SMEs to improve their security, their product or service will become more expensive. And relaying that additional risk management level into basically your bottom line as an organization, which means your profit will go down in order to manage something that may happen, which is in a sense digital risk management, is for many organizations quite difficult to achieve. And even within governments we're seeing now, especially with the NIS2 again coming up, it's quite easy for a sector to make them more stringent on cyber. But if you are buying the stuff from that same sector, you often find that it's still based on lowest price, best quality, but it ends up with a product from a country where you don't want to buy it from. So balancing those two, I think, is at the core of supply chain risk management.
Alors, vous avez déjà évoqué un certain nombre de bonnes pratiques. On va peut-être.
You have mentioned a number of best practices. Now let's concentrate on the best practices. If you were to give 2 or 3 that are really the top best practices, Elise. 2 to 3 is a challenge, but let's try it. I think that the first thing I wanted to highlight is the fact that supply chain security, when you talk about security, first of all, you talk a lot about cyber security, but you mustn't overlook the physical security. So it's both cyber and physical security, which goes hand in hand to go towards a common objective of securing the supply chain. The second is, when we talk about security, we mustn't overlook purchases. Securing supply chain is actually a collaborative work hand in hand with the purchase department, because the purchase department is in charge of the relationship with suppliers, and we, as security department, we provide the strategy that should be applied by, or try to apply by the purchase department. So it's really collaborative work, and I wanted to highlight that because for me, this is the prerequisite when we talk about the security of supply chain. Now, having said that, if we continue the link with purchases, we could talk about the contractual aspect. There are some security appendices, the addendum with some requirements. We talk about how to secure our supplies during the tender, the request for tender phase, ensuring that the supplier has a level of maturity that is sufficient for the shortlisting. We can talk about the security audit, but also we can talk about really how we can improve the safety of supply chain. I will come back to this later on in a collaborative way and all together, because this is everybody's business. So security, purchases, and tender. Well, my approach is slightly different. I agree that to say that purchases are responsible up to the signature of the contract, but then the support, support functions, risks, purchases, privacy, legal, and all that. We support the business up to the business being in a business relationship with vendors. And actually, it is the business who is in charge of this relationship. So if the service degrades, the tool degrades, the maintenance degrades, we don't know about that. It is really the payer who is responsible of that relationship. So it's no longer the purchases or the legal department. And also the business is responsible most of the time and for the continuation to not accept the beta feature that is really very attractive because this is the latest thing that you should have and the competitor also has, without the purchases, without the legal department, without us, without the security aspects. Because the risk analysis at that time, we insert something different, and this is something different than maybe other risks that we haven't covered or assessed, given the digital footprint of the vendor at the time. So classification, which is not set in time, to review the connection with the business is privileged to know what they have in mind before it comes here. Before the renewal of the contract, they know what they're going to push, what they're going to require in terms of services or products. And it's really a strong link. So it's multi-department at all time. And the major challenge, I know that time is flying, but what's very important is that decentralized companies, whether big or small, if you have local points that are sort of self-sufficient, it's very important that each know the right contact. So this continues to work. That's what makes the success and to best address. And if we go through it, at least someone has accepted risk in the company. Doesn't mean it's accepted, it's okay. Now you have to follow it. So this global approach, Samuel, from purchases to business, do you validate that? Well, as I was saying earlier, it's a topic that we are all concerned about. We must be in a position to create this link between purchases, procurement, and the cyber team, and this can be done at a high level to then translate the method to all the activities in the company to have this visibility. So on paper, this is easy. In reality, this is more complex, especially in industry where we do have legacy plants, but also partners like us that are sort of legacy partners on certain offers that make it that we lose sight of them and we find them when we have an incident to manage together. And it happens from time to time and we keep forgetting that. So hence the requirement for visibility, the categorizing of risks. At Schneider, we have 3 steps of risk: on-site, product risk, and risk engineering, so that whenever we have an incident, even if we have a good level of maturity on some of our partners, we can easily have an incident. So to manage that, we need to have that visibility. Are we connected? What does the supplier do? And to do that, we have to onboard the business teams at the very beginning of the story, because they are the one who know the suppliers they're working with, and they can properly assess the level of risk, properly address it. Should we audit them? Should we ask them questions? I think that the key element is to create trust and to have the proper contact points so that there is transparency whenever we have an incident and make quick decisions. The day we have an incident, the question is going to be raised is that, are we going to cut the connections, sending the emails between entities? So we cut the remote accesses of the entity that requires us to have access for maintenance. When we make this type of decision, you need to measure the impact on the activity of the plant or on the business activity. So it's not a quick win because it's extremely complex to implement, and we have a number of them. So our challenge at Schneider is to limit the number of suppliers we work with. So the volume is so enormous that the more we have, the wider the attack surface. So there is a challenge here to reduce the number of suppliers we work with. And we haven't talked about SBOM, so it's great to have our software a bit of material, we can actually react quickly. Then we could talk about the fifth party or whatever, So this is an ecosystem we should talk about, including the countries I cover. We have France, and we love to subcontract in France to level 1, 2, 3, 4, sometimes level 5. And all this makes it complex for the management of everyone. So even if we have a process, not everything is gone, so I'll be more humble than that. Catherine?
Sure. So I agree with everything that the other panelists have said. I think a lot of it had to do with visibility, which it's incredibly important. However, I'm going to look through a little crystal ball here into 3 steps into the future. It's a very big challenge having the resources, the funding to be able to have full visibility into your supply chain. And let's be honest, if it's easy to do and if it's not supply chain, it's going to be some other cyber vulnerability. And if we know that the adversaries are after your data, then at some point, there's a law of diminishing returns for every additional security measure that you put around your castle to protect your crown jewels. So if we plan for the inevitability that your data is going to get stolen, then in my mind, the most reasonable thing to do is to make sure your data is thoroughly protected with strong cryptography. So that's why I love what Raymond said earlier. He kind of fast-tracked us through to the end of the story, which is we need to protect the data. That's ultimately what's at risk. So one of the best practices that I would advise is make sure you know where your data assets live, make sure it's locked up well, and make sure that you're future-proofing it with post-quantum capabilities or at least strong encryption algorithms so that even if you are breached and your data gets exfiltrated, the adversaries can't do anything with it.
Je voudrais juste ajouter que c'est I agree with you, but it's not only data-centric. Because, pardon.
Allez-y en français.
Quand vous avez un
When you have a maintenance operator who is remote, every month is going to adjust the parameter every 6 months and run an update, or just check that everything's fine, is with a new process, the parameter is still valid. It is a remote access. There is no data. But this connection, if it's the same guy who's been coming for 15 years, who's having a coffee with the little teams, it's very important to know, to reinforce the basics. Who came, what, when, to do what, because the connection is still open. And nobody really cares about that. Oh yes, we respected the process, this and that, we traced it. Yes, but this guy has come. Well, yes, it's the week he's supposed to come. So these are small details like that, and it's not necessarily only data. Of course, data is the business is more aware of the data. There's a lot. It's very popular. We have some complicated data as well that is managed by systems that are more and more complex. We can follow that. So it's better mapped the flow of data. We're no longer responsible for that. But a connection that remains open. It's pointless having a probe, an OSOMI probe, if it remains open.
I agree. In instances where we're talking about commercial airlines, critical infrastructure, absolutely. Those have a very important part in supporting everyday life. I agree.
Ramon?
One of the more interesting examples I've seen in improving supply chain security is in the Netherlands. Maybe as a background, in the Netherlands, the government created a sort of an ecosystem around itself on information sharing, which each of the chains in that ecosystem having their own specific task, as we have as Connected Trust as well. What a number of those NGOs did together with industry is to develop an assessment methodology called cyber rating, which can be deployed to any small, medium enterprise, large enterprise, just to determine the criticality of that organization. Once that was proven, it has been objectified in the sense that any third party can do this, or it becomes kind of an audit. It also becomes a certification, so it helps SMEs in presenting them. However, as a second step, they now are moving into the scheme where those large organizations, once they are actually identified as critical, are incentivized to become registered with companies like us. Because what they want to have as part of their control framework is to ensure that your suppliers, and especially your critical suppliers, are properly informed. Because then you get a situation where they have the information, And then you reach a stage of a discussion saying, so are you able to act upon it, or are you missing something? And is that a capability question or a people question? Or so what's behind that? And we find that that two-step approach is quite effective in the Netherlands. It's quite easy to replicate in any country within and outside Europe.
Alors, il nous reste 5 minutes avant de prendre les questions.
We have 5 minutes left before we take a question from the audience. Elise, you were talking about the collaborative approach. What are the main hurdles to this collaborative approach within companies?
Alors, il y en a plusieurs et si on fait
Well, there are several, and if we make the link with what we said before, and in line with the business aspect, the business is key, and we are in a win-win situation, security, purchase and businesses. The challenge we have with the business is really to vulgarize security and quantify associated risks to make them understand why security is important. From a business point of view, is seen as from a technical angle and as a constraint. Today we have the challenge of really making them understand how security could have an impact on their business. That's the first thing. In terms of hurdle, in a more global approach, I will just take a quotation that seems a bit trivial, but it actually applies to the supply chain ecosystem, that alone we go faster, but together we go further. That really defines our posture and also the one we should tend to together. Security is, for me, not defined in a specific sector. Each sector's industry has got specifics in terms of products and services. However, we should state that we all rely on existing standards like ISO 27000, NICE, NIS, and so on. So this means that we all have a common objective of securing our supply chain and securing it globally in the same way with a common purpose. So the main hurdle for us is to say we need all to tend toward the same way, to go in the same direction. So it's key for us to really get out of this as a collaboration. Now, let's try and do it together. Let us stop thinking that we do it better than the others. And I think that's the key message I wanted to convey, and this is the case for all sectors.
We didn't mention this too. We could consider that this is an opportunity. It could also be an obstacle. But at Schneider, we worked a lot with integrators and installers. So depending on the country where we are adapting, or in any case, recording the company, registering the companies, and in almost all European countries. So it represents a lot of work, but countries, they don't always transfer it in the same way. And so we have expectations that are different between countries. And so regarding the integrators that are between our end customers and you, as they are not always impacted by NIS 2. So really this is an opportunity, and the idea is to onboard, to have everybody on board. So if those that help us integrate our products are there, so there's probably this to take into account, and it might be missing a little bit. This is not something we have in France, we have it in Germany, so it raises issues as well about talking the same language. We can talk about norms as well, that everybody goes at the same pace in the ecosystem so that we apply the same rules. It's easier when we talk the same language, so to complete what was just said. Lucie, you wanted to react? Yes, regarding hurdles, we try to standardize best practices and remain open to those best practices which locally can make sense and can be applied to the rest of the organization, because I mean, it goes both ways, basically. So it's top-down or bottom-up. So sometimes they know better than us, but it cannot always be applied everywhere, so we have to manage this. And second thing that is a bit less obvious, and thank you for mentioning the security parts for a rating. So it's important because it's step zero to know what we are talking about. And there's a lot of teams that say, you know, have the latest reports, and I won't mention them, but we all know who they are for those tools. And so sometimes a score of 820 out of 1,000 is great in a report, but sometimes there's no IP address that is scanned, which means that in fact it's just fake, basically. So we have to understand how it's done and what it means. So most of the tools now and rating use CTI, same thing. What is there? And you have to transmit to the teams, and they have to understand what there is behind the figures. And so do they monitor the right companies? So you know, if you look only at the parent company, but if there's an incident in a subsidiary, then you are not aware at all. So, Catherine?
One thing that I would add as an obstacle is incentives, right? So I think when we're looking at all of our cumulative efforts in here, everybody here needs to fight to prioritize cybersecurity. Everybody here needs to fight for budget to support supply chain, right, and supply chain vulnerability management. However, what if we could create some incentives, possibly with in mind the cybersecurity labeling program? If you're able to demonstrate a certain level of cybersecurity resilience, maybe cyber insurance could be cheaper. Maybe the country could offer tax incentives. We could reduce the costs for operators to support supply chain vulnerability management or any cyber initiative for that matter by offsetting the cost of it through additional incentives. So more of like a carrot approach as opposed to a stick.
So this year I'll be wrapping up my PhD research on decision-making processes on digital risk. I think if there's one hurdle which hasn't been mentioned yet, it's the hurdle at the board level, at the C-level. Because if there's one main challenge I'm seeing is that still cybersecurity is treated as a technical problem. And it's not. It's a human problem. And if people keep treating it as something you can control, which means you have a problem and then you implement the solution, then you're done with it, then that becomes the source of your overall problems. And as long as people, both practitioners, IT staff and C-level, doesn't accept the fact that technology is becoming more dynamic each year. So if technology keeps on changing, connectivity keeps changing, business processes keep improving, but risks consequently are increasing as well. And you cannot improve a process by digital transformation without accepting the dynamics of that transformation. So anyone who wants to have a compliant-driven risk approach or who wants to just get a tool or move into the cloud and be done with it, they are mistakenly wrong and most likely the first ones to suffer the consequences of that thinking. So getting everybody, practitioners, operational, strategic, tactical levels, into that mindset of it's dynamic, it's always changing, which is tiring, it's not a fun thing to accept, but it's necessary in order to keep at pace at where technology is going at the moment.
Merci beaucoup. On va avoir...
Thank you so much. We have now 10 minutes for Q&As from the room. Any question to ask to our guests? Sir, yes? First of all, thank you very much. I have a question to widen the debate. Maybe not about securing the supply chain, but securing, being secure regarding your supply chain yourself. So we talked about collaborative approach before with major suppliers, especially in the digital or in the US. Sometimes we struggle to negotiate certain clauses in the contracts and be protected against certain elements that are provided for by these suppliers. So I wanted to know, I can talk about extraterritoriality or especially potential exploitation. So I wanted to know if you had met these issues and how did you deal with them basically? Or maybe be protected against these elements. Thank you. Who wants to answer? I have the case every week, clearly, whether major suppliers or startups that say, no, it's my template, and I don't want your security prerequisites because, and I know you want our product, and business says we should have signed last week, so they just wait. And in fact, you have to adopt a strong position. And in fact, we realized that if you talk to human beings working in the company, it's better, but in any case, it will be their terms and conditions. So this is where you have to raise awareness and train, in fact, your businesses so that they are never left on their own. Because in fact, the negotiation job within the procurement team is what saves us. So the stakes as well in assessing privacy, finance, due diligence are very important, because all these are levers to show the weaknesses in the sellers to the sellers themselves, saying, did you see here, this is not the mirror you have. So here we saw all that. So we are interested in your product, but we won't go at any cost without you explaining how you will remediate all this. So again, it's risk management in the contract, that it can also enable us to reinforce the liability clauses where we ask them, in case of incidents, to pay much more, basically. So it's negotiations.
Getting the procurement done is challenge one. The other one we find very often among large companies is who keeps track on the ownership once a supplier is actually being procured. So, for example, we had many cases in Europe we've seen where a German or a French company was the initial contracted party and then got bought by a Chinese company. So what does that do for the contract? Is there a bailout clause in order to get out? And you may replace China, for example, by the US or any company or any organization, because they're obliged to keep by the law. So it's not for them to blame, but you need the clause in there if something may change. So it's not just a technical thing, it's also an ownership question where the wrong country suddenly can switch leadership and can go in the direction which is opposite to where you want to go as a company.
Elise?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the collaboration aspect, it will only answer part of your question, because indeed we have the same challenge faced with major providers, suppliers, but I believe that the future position is really to go for a collaborative ecosystem, and also realizing that we have a certain level of maturity with our suppliers, and also with our contractual expectations. So we all want to know the level of maturity of our supplier. And to do that, within Airbus, for example, we have an ongoing project to optimize all the cyber assessment that we do within our ecosystem with the whole of the ecosystem. And so this is the future for me, to say, right, we all agree on a level for which we acknowledge that the supplier got a certain level of maturity. Today we have programs such as INCYBER and so on to aim at that. But in the future, the idea is really to work with all the whole ecosystem to see how we can avoid to replicate the same assessment that we do with suppliers that we have in common. And this is key for the future, and it means that we can also have a real lever in terms of contract negotiation and say, right, we all agreed on a standard, on a way of assessing our suppliers, and to do that, maybe we can focus only on expectations that are specific to the sector. Another question right at the top of the room.
Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for your speeches. In terms of cyber maturity referencing, whether you have 10 subcontractors or thousands like some of you, What is it based on, basically? The certification for cyber maturity that they provide. Personally, in our industry, we send with the support of our ministry a survey with about 20 questions based on declarations only. And as a supplier for other major defense groups that I won't mention, we were bombarded with surveys of more than 2,000 questions, and I refused to answer them. So the types of standards that you use, and how you do this, and how do you check that, and da-da-da, and how do you trust your suppliers, etc.
Ok.
Qui veut répondre?
Who wants to answer that? I'll start. So I'm smiling because it's a real challenge, let's face it. We realize it as a major industrial player. You mentioned, well, I think you're talking about the fundamentals DGS questionnaire, if I'm not mistaken, right? Okay, I knew it. This is a self-declaration indeed. So quite frankly, we cannot trust self-declaration for many reasons, several reasons. The first one is, a supplier that really wants to join the ecosystem of the industrial player says that they are great everywhere, and we realize afterwards that it's not the case, and others are really sincere, but it has a negative impact in a way. So self-declaration is complicated because each one has got their own way of self-assessing, basically, and this is why, going back to what I was saying just before, we really want to have a project to optimize all those assessments, cyber assessments, and agree on a standard and a method to optimize and reduce as well the situation that you all know today, to say, well, each one sends their own questionnaire, their own survey, their own guidelines, and suppliers are drowned under thousands of questions to answer, and it's a nightmare for the supplier, and we lose quality as well from a customer point of view. So to answer the standards that we use, the standards, as I said before, we use existing standards such as ISO 27000, etc. In terms of defense, if we talk about the purely defense part, let's say we work with DGA, and this is the cyber guidelines, for example, with the fundamental level to say, we're talking about defense, but we have a common basis between civil and defense fields for those that are kind of in between the two. And then there's still some work to do, I'm aware, and this is part of the project that I'm leading within my ecosystem, but what we do can be replicated as well to other businesses as well.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
So we talk a lot about different maturities, and that one has a higher maturity than the other, and you can talk about what do you demand in the classification. But is there also an informal role of the larger companies to share knowledge, to share their ideas, like the big brother or big sister helping the little ones? The informal role within the chain. What do you think, as for example, as Snyder, do you take that extra responsibility for the chain above what you normally would do?
I would say sometimes we save extra time to help them and to say, if you're more mature, then it will help your other clients, you'll be more visible, and you'll be more wanted. And also, the way it's an approach. It means that the more that you have a trust center in your public website showing your certification or your path to certification or your last findings and security audit, your last sometimes risk matrix with 0 on critical findings on your last 6 months security audit. I don't even do RFP.
So the companies who are involved in the cyber rating development in the Netherlands, they actually take that approach. Some of them provide support to especially their critical suppliers by providing from their security teams even support for high notifications. So it's really critical. Then they can call the large company for support if they're unable to resolve it themselves. The most extreme example we've seen on your question is that we actually seen among those companies a willingness to lend money to SMEs to actually improve their cyber capabilities, knowing that they'll be repaying their own money through the price of the services they are providing. But it's for them an indication that it's quickly being improved on the capability level, while also accepting the fact that you will pay a higher price for it. So whether you do it in the end through regulation or you do it now by lending it, in the end, on the short term, you're even more helped than in another way.
If there's an acceptable level of risk there, I've seen also vendors bake into their contract certain milestones, like you can achieve this at this milestone in the 6-month mark, provided that it is within the acceptable risk of the the end customer. I think that there's a reputational benefit here too. If it's within their power contractually to say this company is being protected by X or their supply chain is being protected by X, that is a nice way of providing a intrinsic value, up-leveling and globally recognizing their level of cybersecurity maturity as they look to expand their business, outside of the customers that they already protect.
Alors nous avons le temps de prendre une...
We have time for one last question, sir. Good morning, thank you for your answers. What advice would you give to manage the invisible suppliers? I'm thinking about in terms of software development or the components of the libraries for which developers make the choice to integrate in the source code or not, that can have impacts, major significant impacts in terms of vulnerability. So how do you manage those invisible suppliers which are part of our products? Thank you. Well, 2 words, awareness and training, basically. Control, audits, and don't give in. So we said before, this is a governance issue. So even for R&D teams, we have to onboard them. So obviously awareness, training, procurement, to avoid a shadow, well, whatever you want to call it, but we go back to what we were saying before about governance and then risk assessment and making sure that we don't miss some suppliers. Even though in real life, everything we said on paper works, but in fact, there's always a few that can be missed. So I mentioned the SBAM before, so the mapping of the software of all the components you have in terms of hardware and software, this is crucial to know who provides what, where it comes from, and the level of risk it represents in your ecosystem. So visibility, yes, I would say, this is the initial job, and it's done with awareness, training, close to the field, with the players that are impacted, and not only on software, for hardware as well. In the chat, it's the same thing, finance, same thing. So everybody's impacted, and management as well, reinforcing whatever the level of management, but managers are responsible, very much responsible, in fact, the only responsible of what is provided by their team. So if the manager is certified, it's been 10, 15 years and it's been working well, no. What is delivered in 6 months, you look at what is expected, etc., etc., and before it is officially delivered internally or externally, you have to have the first internal verification within the team.
I think one of the interesting trends we're seeing scale up quickly since last year to address this problem is that I'm now seeing in the large companies for since long development teams. It's no longer DevOps. So you're seeing that instead of procuring everything, when it's really critical to the primary process of the organization, suddenly I'm seeing 50, 80, 100 people doing development or finishing up development, but it gives you the governance structure to actually make sure that the development team is looking into every aspect of the architecture, where the data is going, leaving, and being kept within the company. I think that's an interesting challenge and development which is promising.
Merci, merci pour vos questions. Merci à
That is it. Thank you very much to the 5 speakers. Big round of applause to them.